Thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez for helping to support the channel. The Last Great Time War is one of the defining events in Doctor Who history. Happening off-screen between eras of the show, this giant cataclysmic conflict reshaped the very structure of the Doctor Who universe and changed everything. It was a pretty big deal, but as the years have passed since its introduction, the Time War has become less and less mysterious, with more pieces of media focusing on the conflict itself and taking place within its confines. But is this a good thing? Does it help the show or does it harm it? This is a debate that has been going on for many years now, and as someone who grew up during the first Russell T Davies era, when the Time War was at its most influential, I feel like I should weigh in with my own thoughts on the topic. Because it's a period that has always fascinated me and caused my imagination to run more wild than Hulkamania. So, without any further introduction, let's take a look into whether Doctor Who has ruined the Time War. Oh yeah, and I'm going to be saying the word war a lot. Sorry in advance.
Listen, don't mention the war. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it alright.
So to begin, let's take a look at why Russell T Davies created the Time War to begin with. Obviously, when Doctor Who returned in 2005, there was a ridiculous amount of baggage considering the 26 years of episodes, all the way from 1963 to 1989. If the show came back to screens as a direct continuation, it would have a much harder chance of succeeding, because not only would it have to deal with the less than stellar reputation of Doctor Who's later years, but the show would also be a lot less accessible for new viewers. So, in order to create this clean break, Davies elected to wedge a huge, universe-altering event in between the 1996 movie and his own take on the series. This, of course, was the Last Great Time War, a conflict between the Time Lords, the Doctor's own people, and the Daleks, his greatest enemy. It essentially wiped out the two most continuity-based elements of the show in one fell swoop. A really good way of hitting a reset button of sorts, and providing that much-needed clean slate for the show to work. It was especially important to set the darker and more moody atmosphere of the show under Davies, giving the Doctor this mysterious event in his past that was new for both old fans and newcomers alike. It was designed purely as a narrative tool, a way to justify all these changes, and as we see throughout the first Russell T Davies era, I don't think he ever really intended to elaborate any further on the conflict, let alone show it in any significant form. Indeed, there's a clear pattern throughout the 9th and 10th Doctor stories which show Davies' vision for the Time War. From the very beginning, it's just a vague event haunting the Doctor, something that influences his decision making and causes him constant anguish. He barely even opens up about it in series 1 and 2, we only really get to see how it affects his relationship with the Daleks on a character level. By the end of series 1, we only know a couple of things about the actual conflict. We know it was a time war, whatever that means. We know it affected some other alien species such as the Gelth and Nestine Consciousness. We're aware that it was a battle between the Daleks and the Time Lords, resulting in the Doctor wiping out both. But that's pretty much it. The closest thing we get to actually seeing anything from the Time War in series 1 and 2 are the Cult of Skaro and the Dalek Emperor, some major players who managed to survive. But all of these aspects are merely the consequences, not the actual events of the war itself. And I think that's a key part to Davies' vision, because he seems to have envisaged the Time War as something utterly incomprehensible and unquantifiable for our tiny human minds. Because the Time War itself was never that important, just the aftermath and its effects on the characters like the Doctor, the Master and the Daleks. I think one of the main ways Davies explores the Time War is by mythologizing it, turning it into a legend and creating this surreal reputation for it. It's spoken about with these incredible descriptions and phrases, which in turn makes it a bigger deal because it's all left to the imagination. There's absolutely no frame of reference or contextualization. We never get to see even the slightest of flashbacks for the majority of his era. It's all just the combatants recalling the events, such as hearing about Time Lords dying and being resurrected again and again in an endless slaughter across multiple time periods and different levels of reality. There's just no way to really show that or even tether it to anything we can easily understand, because it's meant to be so out of the realm of what we know to be possible in our universe. When the Doctor talks about trying to rescue Davros' ship from the jaws of the Nightmare Child, we can only attempt to try and visualize that, which makes it seem so much more alien and mysterious. It conjures up the idea of some giant Lovecraftian entity devouring an entire Dalek ship to the backdrop of an interdimensional portal or cosmic landmark. We don't get some traditional flashback showing the events, which is a rare example of telling achieving so much more than showing, because trying to put visuals to such an impactful and surreal moment would just do it a disservice and make it much less cool or interesting. Instead, the show emphasises these name drops like Skaro degradations and Gates of Elysium. I know this is a cheap way of making things sound oh so mysterious and intriguing, but it works because the Time War was never meant to have true substance. Look no further than Russell's unpublished 2013 short story, Doctor Who and the Time War. This was planned to be released in Doctor Who magazine to celebrate the 50th anniversary and show the regeneration of the 8th Doctor into the 9th, but of course Moffat then had to squash the whole idea because of his own plans. But the story was released in 2020, and it gives us possibly the biggest indication of how Davis viewed the Time War. The story sees the final day and it's full of all of these kinds of mystical names and phrasing to create this alien atmosphere, and it also attempts to highlight the impossible scale of the war, suggesting that Earth itself had been replicated 1,000,000 times, turned into bullets used against the Nightmare Child. Throughout the war, the Doctor had been aged to 1,000,000 years and then turned back into a baby, a process once again used as ammunition at the so-called Battle of Rodan's Wedding, whatever that is. It's clear throughout this whole story that Davis purposefully wanted the Time War to be this way, something full of contradictions and confusion, because humans are a lesser species who weren't involved or even aware of it. So as a human audience consuming Doctor Who, we shouldn't be able to rationalise it or understand the conflict either. What's plasma space? What's foul space? What in God's name are the Death Smiths of Goth? Words and terms like these are meant to be utter sci-fi gobbledygook because it keeps the Time War at an important distance from the audience ourselves. We were never meant to see the Could Have Been King with his army of meanwhiles and neverwheres, or all these other things that scared even the Doctor and pushed the mighty Time Lords to the very brink. There's power in mystery. Look no further than the acclaimed episodes Midnight and Listen, stories which have no defined threat and leave it completely up to the viewer to fill in the gaps, with whatever eldritch horrors our minds can possibly conjure up to match the terror implied in these episodes. It's what makes them such standout stories because they leave so much unanswered. Hell, it was even the same with the Weeping Angels in their first appearance, since Blink explains that nobody knows what the monsters truly look like due to them becoming locked in this statue form upon being observed. If we got to see the Midnight Entity, it would become something tangible, something we can understand, and that would ruin its appeal. We don't know the motivations of the entity, how it survived on the planet, and how it was capable of doing all these things it does in the episode, which comes as a shocking revelation after the dust settles, because we realise nothing was really learned even after all that chaos. We're just as in the dark as ever before, except now there's a chilling knowledge that something is out there. This is the kind of effect Davis wanted from the Time War. He explains that the whole thing took place in the Vortex and the Void themselves, leaving the majority of the universe completely untouched outside of some minor timeline alterations here and there. Even in Parting of the Ways, it's claimed that the Daleks simply vanished from the universe as we know it. To the rest of reality, nothing seemed to be happening at all, making it a sort of silent war. Only the higher species knew anything that was going on. You know, the Eternals and such. It's also probably part of why Davis sealed the conflict behind a time lock. Obviously, this was mainly in anticipation of the question of why the Doctor couldn't go back into the war, but it also serves as a way to lock the conflict away from the prying eyes and hands of other writers who might try elaborating on it. But of course, this didn't stop them trying. The only other TV writer to significantly touch upon the Time War is Davis's successor Stephen Moffat, who himself had used the power of mystery with the Weeping Angels, and yet Moffat attempted to show the conflict not once, not twice, but 3 different times, all in relation to the 50th anniversary special. However, the main thing these 3 glimpses of the Time War share is the idea of much more conventional warfare. Rather than these grand cosmic battlefields populated by megastructures and superweapons, as fleets of battle TARDISes clash against Daleks and their nightmarish creations, everything is a lot more grounded with laser rifles and streets filled with rubble. It's a far cry from the way the conflict had been built up throughout the Russell T Davies era. However, it is of course important to note that The Last Day and Day of the Doctor take place on the final day of the Time War, when all those fancy weapons had been used up and the scale had shrunk down to essentially sticks and stones in the rubble of Gallifrey itself. This is consistent with the only time the Davies era showed the Time War, with the end of time showing the desperate Time Lords trying to escape their destruction on this final day. It's probably the only part of the event you can actually get away with showing, because it's that end point where there was nothing left and it becomes more of a normal war again. However, it is still a bit disappointing to finally get to see a Time War battle and for it to be so unremarkable. We don't really get to see anything special or new there. It's just a bit of a cookie cutter science fiction battle, which immediately displays the danger of attempting to show any aspects of the Time War. Even the technicalities like this begin to devalue the legendary and surreal status 5 years of the show had carefully cultivated. Due to the Time War's significance to Doctor Who both on and off screen, it goes without saying that a lot of writers want to explore the cosmic, multi-dimensional playground it exists within. By this point, there is a lot of Time War media, mainly courtesy of Big Finish audio dramas. There's the 8th Doctor Time War, Gallifrey Time War, the War Doctor and the War Master Ranges, all taking place in and around the titular conflict. This sheer amount of releases already causes some level of fatigue to set in, but much like Night of the Doctor and Day of the Doctor, they're smart enough to keep things to the fringes and the outskirts of the conflict. They don't get too involved, which is very important for all the reasons I've already explained. However, even if they do maintain some level of detachment, there is still a sense of them encroaching more and more each time, slowly eroding the prestige and mystery of the Time War. I think the first big misstep actually comes from Night of the Doctor, which introduces the character of Cass Fermazzi, a human. Now, in case you somehow missed it in the multiple times I already explained, the Time War was initially meant to be completely shut off to lower forms of life, which in the Doctor Who universe includes humans. I mean, in Davies' original vision, not even the Centaurans and Cybermen were part of it, so why would humans be involved? The book Engines of War, which introduces the War Doctor's companion Cinder, makes the conflict feel very terrestrial, a common issue with these expanded media releases, because more and more lesser species end up getting shoehorned into the Time War, a conflict they were never meant to be in, so it therefore constantly devalues it and makes everything less surreal than it was meant to be. Once humans and other lesser beings are introduced into Time War media, the rest of the dominoes start to fall pretty rapidly and the event loses its luster. Because this is how we find out what Skaro degradations are. And yeah, they're just a slightly more mutated Dalek, which are apparently more dangerous. Not very exciting, is it? And then the ultimate sin, the Nightmare Child, gets revealed as just a new type of Dalek which rejected its body and started to consume its own kind, becoming out of control. 12 Angels Weeping has a whole story about it, which goes into detail regarding the Nightmare Child and exactly what it looks like. The short story, The Third Wise Man, explains how it appears as a swarm of a million small pieces moving like a school of fish consuming thousands of Daleks, and sure, it has tendrils to keep it a bit Lovecraftian, but it doesn't feel satisfying to learn what this mysterious entity actually is. Its original name drops were so vague and tantalizing that it could literally be anything. Some epic and terrifying cosmic horror entity outside of the boundaries of our own imagination. Writer Dave Rudden even admitted that he felt like he didn't fully explain the creature, which I think serves as further proof that it shouldn't have even been attempted. Because any explanation is too much. Any kind of description means we're forced into a certain picture, drastically limiting the potential for boundless fear and terror. Even tiptoeing around the edges of the war like Big Finish audios answer too many questions, solve too many mysteries, and exposes too many secrets. Nothing can ever live up to the imaginative names and teases, because the more we see of any part of the Time War, the less special and interesting it ultimately becomes as a whole. There's no way to do the conflict justice. so you should just leave it alone and instead focus on the aftermath and the consequences. I mean, if you go into too much detail trying to actually structure everything, then you end up with something like the War in Heaven and the Faction Paradox, which are complete continuity nightmares with so many moving parts that it's completely indecipherable and just a complete mess. So just leave the Time War being mysterious and not like that. There's nothing anywhere close to the Time War in other sci-fi franchises. Not even Star Wars or Star Trek have conflicts this scale. They all exist within set limits and obey certain laws of physics and order. This allows them to have tangible roots and actual defined stories, which makes sense. The closest thing in Star Wars that I can think of in terms of scale is the Yuzong Vong invasion, which saw the Jedi and New Republic trying to fight force-resistant aliens from another galaxy, which used biological technology, therefore making them completely different to anything else in the Star Wars universe. The death toll was in the trillions, including a number of major characters, and the 5-year conflict left a serious and lasting impact on the galaxy, with huge ramifications affecting the rest of Star Wars media after that point. But even this pales in comparison to the multi-dimensional timeline chaos of the Time War. Like I've said many times throughout this video, the Time War was designed to be unquantifiable and incomprehensible. Unlike the Yuzong Vong invasion and whatever the biggest Star Trek conflict is, the Time War simply wasn't meant to be experienced or observed. It was only supposed to be background storytelling to fuel character motivations, not an actual setting or a backdrop. It reminds me of the conjunction of the spheres from the Witcher series, something only there to establish the world and the lore rather than being a physical event we witness. To properly venture into this period of the Doctor Who universe is a big mistake because it can only ever disappoint. And to answer the question in the title of the video, I don't think Doctor Who has ruined the Time War. Yet. But I do think it's getting dangerously close. What began as a plot device to make the show more accessible has now become a gargantuan monster of a continuity mess, tying itself into knots and becoming less and less special. With every new Big Finish box set, the Time War just feels more derivative and uninspired. It's quickly becoming unimaginative and overexposed, because there's no mystery anymore. There's no longer anything surreal there. Because now we can quantify it, and we have the adventures of the War Doctor and the adventures of the young War Doctor, so we're getting his complete timeline, and we're seeing all these things that we were never supposed to see. But what do you think? Has the Time War been ruined? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. And a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patrons Maximilian Foreman and Nick's Games, and my Gold level patrons Boots, Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Franz Horn aka Line Vortex, Herna Verzog, and Tom Azar. Thank you so much for your support.